Decentralize all the things. Decentralize all the things.
Hey there. Welcome to the Web3 Summit Decentralize Now podcast series, hosted by the Decentralize All The Things podcast network. This series features discussions about decentralization from the 2018 Web3 Summit held in Berlin, Germany. This is episode 6. In this episode, we listen in on a roundtable discussion about signaling for consensus and the challenges of decentralized governance. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoy the show.
So, the point of this discussion is really about governance and how do we reach a consensus for a blockchain protocol when no one knows what other people are thinking, right? And it's really an open discussion about any topics that we want, kind of any subtopics that we want. So do you guys have, I know he wants to talk about Tenegraph, which is an awesome project that I also work on. But maybe you guys have a topic of discussion that you want to make sure we get covered. No? Do you have a topic at all? Okay, cool. Well, do you want to kick us off and tell us why this is important?
It's important because as each member of the blockchain, in isolation, information isolation leads to fear and not knowing what everyone else is doing. And in the case of a blockchain, you sort of all have to move together. You all have to move forward. And if you're not sure that the person next to you is also going to move forward, it's hard to move in confidence. And as we with Ethereum and elsewhere, like any blockchain, as trying to develop and progress, we have to make sure we're all at least on the same page about what everyone else is thinking before we can even decide for ourselves how to move forward. And so any thoughts or other things that you just came in, Zaki? Yeah. So we're doing a talk on signaling and governance and reaching consensus and if there's anything you want to go over while we're in here? Just coming into chat. Okay. Some observations from the space. So my project is gathering all these signals and putting them into one place and trying to show it. And it's a project called Tenegraph. And when I talk with people initially, the first reaction is pretty much universally, oh yeah, we definitely need that. Oh yeah, we definitely need that. It would be great if everyone was on the same page about should we move the hard fork forward or back, or at least on the same page about what other people's opinions are, right? And so I could say for sure this group is feeling this way, and I am for sure feeling this way, and not having your ideas about it. Oh yes, Laurel.
How do you go about actually pulling these opinions and remarks from people? Like, is there some sort of bot that's like pulling information from people, or is someone selecting whose voices are important? Are people like self-selecting? How does that work?
It's a little bit of a mix. So there's a couple of things going on. There's like coin signaling and gas voting signaling that is not that. I mean, could be biased in some sense, but it's at least it's at least Sybil resistant to a certain degree, right? And that gives kind of its own unique, and it also has its own unique challenges. And in the case of the stances, and there's a combination of having a list of influential people and seeing how they view different EIPs, and then also people just saying, hey, this is a Twitter post saying this person supports this EIP, or this is a Reddit post where this person supports this EIP, and on the site uploading it so everyone can see it. And they had this for Bitcoin when they were going through their hard fork called CoinDance, and that's a lot of where the inspiration of we really need something like this for Ethereum came from, and why it hasn't happened yet, and now we're here to kind of make it happen.
Yeah, and you can see right now there's this debate. Are we pushing should we push back this hard fork or not, right? And Afri and Peter and all the guys who are really in charge of interfacing with that they get people coming out on Twitter and Reddit saying, "You guys suck. Why can't you just push this hard fork through?" Right? And who knows who these people are, right? And like poor Afri has to like defend himself on Twitter. He doesn't know what other people are. Does the whole world think that this hard fork needs to be pushed ASAP, or is there split opinion? Who thinks what? Instead he just has to like see his Twitter feed and the people that are willing to either support what he says or like talk shit. Whereas if we had a website where you could basically see what other people are signaling about this topic, then you could have a coin vote where anyone with Ether could vote on whether or not this is yes or no. And they could go there and with a click of a button, sign a message from their MetaMask account or something like that. And boom, there's what the hodlers are thinking. And then Slockit is working on this thing called gas voting. And really, it's a coin vote, gas vote, and other things, right? Where they measure the amount of gas that you've spent, right? So that's like a user vote. And then there's the amount of gas that contracts that your account has deployed have used, right? So if you're Nick Johnson and you deployed ENS, then you're going to be like, there's a lot of people spending a lot of gas on that application. So your account will have a huge vote on the developer spectrum, right? And then, of course, if you just have a lot of Ether, that's a normal coin vote. And so you could, with one button click, you would be able to see, oh, well, this guy is a developer, and the people who have spent a lot of have deployed contracts that have had a lot of gas spent on them. This is what they say, and it looks like it's 59%, or in this case, it'd be 98% support Afri and Peter's push to delay the hard fork. And then they could actually point to that and be like, look, all the developers, all the users, these guys are on this site, they're being polled right now, and it sure looks like they support our decision, and they can feel confident in the decisions they're making. This is also another one for like another contentious issue is EIP 999, right? Where maybe the developers, the users, the dApps, and miners, and everyone might have their own opinion, and it's a contentious issue. So we need a way to actually poll these people and aggregate that information. The funny thing is, all this information is already out there, right? Influencer stances. Hey, Anna. Great. It's all out there, and it's really easy to grab it, but it's got to be all in one place so people can easily go to one spot and say, oh yeah, okay, Vitalik says this, Gavin says this, and Vlad says this, but these guys all disagree. Okay, whatever. At least I know, And so the challenge is really like, how do we sort that data? How do we aggregate it? And it's going to be contentious, right?
I'll just jump in, yeah. Just a thought on that. Like I agree for something where it's maybe a technical decision to make, and if you might want to value more the technical or people who have gas, as in they built things of utility, so maybe their opinion should be worth more in certain ways. But that might could have its consequences in becoming an echo chamber if people who are more technically minded will probably think a certain way versus maybe the general public who would use it, and then you'll get something like Trump happening again, where those who were outside of certain influence maybe felt disenfranchised and then rallied or went a certain way. I don't know. I'm just wondering, our echo chamber's a consideration in this, in that we might favor, it's a double-edged thing that I do agree that technical people should make technical decisions, but might that form an echo chamber that will bite us in the back later? Just a thought.
I mean, they did mention that, for the gas voting at least, you would have the user side, right, spending gas, and then the contracts that you're receiving gas. And that way you can see when an issue is contentious, because the users would all go one way and the developers would all go the other way or something like that. And
I guess and maybe even for that user one, the gas, it's more so the deployer of a contract, so someone who's technically competent built something that people used, but it's still not necessarily the users voting, but maybe that's not an issue in that case.
Well, for that one, there's the contracts one, but there's like this address also has spent gas, and that would be a user vote. So like with one vote, you would be voting as a user, as a developer, as a miner, and as a coin hodler, because your account has all those aspects to it. But the main way, there's always going to be an echo chamber in the different stakeholder categories. And that's why it's important to identify who are the stakeholders in these consensus protocols, right? There's miners, there's important node operators like exchanges, right? There's general influencers, people who are popular on Twitter, like Vlad, for instance. He's not actually really a dev. He's a researcher. He's not going to deploy any contracts, but clearly he has influence. And so he's a stakeholder in the consensus protocol. If he says something, then people will listen, and that will have influence, right? There's also devs, obviously, and levels of devs. There's core devs that are working on the protocol, and then there's dApp developers, right, who are using the protocol. And so if you can actually aggregate information in a way where it's organized information so that you have the different stakeholders, you'll see, oh yeah, this echo chamber here, this echo chamber here, this echo chamber here. But then you'll have all the different pieces who have different stakes. You know, the miners are not going to be excited about lowering the gas from 3 ether to 2, lowering the block reward from 3 to 2 ether. Clearly, right? They're not going to be into that. But they are going to be big fans of the proof of work algorithm changing so that we can get rid of ASICs. Or maybe not, you know, but like now there's a push, if the hard fork gets delayed, does that get added in to this next hard fork? And all the miners would, of course, say yes, whereas maybe the core devs would say no. But maybe enough core devs have actually tested it that it is going through. And Afri, who works for Parity, he just hadn't seen that there was a lot of support for this. But if this website existed, he would be like, oh, wow, all these developers are actually saying it would be good to integrate this in. Maybe I need to do a second look and see what I thought was wrong, maybe that's been fixed. And maybe it can go in the hard fork.
I just had a random thought about gas voting. If you remember that contract that I think Phil Diane was working on, where like it stores random data on the blockchain, and then later you can get your gas back by releasing that random data. Would things like that have to be taken account of, because they could probably skew things?
So that's gas token. I think that was his thing. That was about showing how in high volume times and like the gas prices go up, you could actually sort of like gather gas to sell at this higher rate and make money off it. I mean, that was a cool experiment that showed a problem in the initial system. I think what you're describing is something like if they were able to do something similar and then force a vote, or like
you'd use gas token, and then you'd have, or like the person who deployed the gas token would have a way larger gas.
Yeah, if, for instance, this is a great example, because at least the way we expect to do this website is that every like gas token or the gas thing is specifically Slockit is working on that, right? And they developed that. They can change the algorithm to blacklist gas that was spent by addresses that are participating in that program, and include the tokens. People who bought a lot of gas in advance, maybe they should have some kind of stake, and that algorithm is going to be tweaked. And this is the interesting part, because we're aggregating the data, we're not necessarily developing that system. So what happens if somebody like Slockit decides to change the algorithm that they're using to influence a certain vote? I mean, these are definitely real concerns. The nice thing about signaling is it's signaling. It's not voting. So you don't have some outcome that's like guaranteed to happen. So if these signals have to maintain legitimacy, otherwise they won't be listened to. And if there's a problem with the algorithm or something breaks or somebody's fucking with it. Like, I mean, Slockit already did the DAO, right? So like, come on, they probably fucked this up too. I say that because I worked with Slockit and did the DAO. But so like,
and another piece is like, as if you zoom out, signaling's great, right? As you zoom in on each individual signaling type, you find flaws like that. And what's like after you realize that, the next realization is, as long as you're transparent and understand what could be the weaknesses, then me as a user can recognize that it may be a little bit, it may be a little bit there. And the important part is not to just have one of those, because if you have one, then that becomes like a total failure point. But if you have 5 different kind of signals and each of them has their own unique weakness, then you have this web of supporting information to give that creates this 3D picture of what's really going on and overcomes the individual obstacles that each individual signal has.
Yeah, so I got here a little late, so maybe you guys already touched this, but this is the gameability issue. Did you talk about that for the first 10 minutes? No. Okay. So the concern so I'm Anna, and I've also been working on this project, so gameability, yeah. So I think that's been a criticism or a concern lobbed at this project. So people have been like, oh, but if you start collecting this stuff and formalizing this stuff, then it's gameable. And I think what you are describing is like one possible gameable thing, although I think that would have to be something that's taken into account. I think one of the things that I find so funny about the argument that this system is in any way more gameable is if you look at Twitter and Reddit, which is currently those are the sources that are used the most to define community sentiment. They are so gamed. They are constantly gamed. You see them, like that is what happened with Trump and Brexit. Like those have been gamed in larger contexts, and we see it being gamed now. So then I think the idea here is have multiple, like you just mentioned this, but have multiple signals, which would then add this like larger meta overview so that, say, one of those systems gets gamed. I mean, to game all of them would require a very different skill set and far more energy and far more money. Yeah.
You mean a nation state?
Yeah, a nation state. But I mean, if a nation state wants to go after Bitcoin, they could also do that.
But how's a nation state? Are they going to hack Vitalik's, Vlad's, Gavin's Twitter, and Afri's Twitter and like get all these guys to make stances? And then like, are they going to hack exchanges and get them to say that they support a fork or not?
If you're talking specifically in this, okay, yeah. Bringing the focus in specifically to this point of changes, yeah. But otherwise, gaming all the different sources of public sentiment obviously just went through, and it's coming clear in the 2016 election in the U.S. did happen, right? Whether it was Twitter, Facebook, all of those otherwise large pools, they were gamed, and they're still being gamed.
And something we're a little bit of the fish in the water, looking at the fish in the blockchain space. But things like coin signaling and gas voting are way less gameable than traditionally what we have, right? And of course, it's easy to find the flaws in things, and it's a lot harder to put all. It's more important to see them and move forward, and build something with it, right? Like actually develop, because I think there's a little bit of paralysis when it comes to this problem, because as soon as someone sees, hey, this is a thing, then everyone kind of steps back. And I mean, Ethereum's been around for a lot of years, and we still don't really have a good way of doing this. And I think that fear comes from, if you're observing a system, you are somehow interacting with it. And by interacting with it, you've modified it and changed it, and we've sort of tainted the purity of what's going on. And and so when I hear that, I kind of hear almost a fear of self-awareness of what's really, really going on. And yeah.
I noticed that too. Like, so people who are selling something have that problem where it's like, if you're selling something, you're really into something, if you're dogmatic about something, if you're like, I believe and I want you to believe, then you sometimes don't want all of the information that is true. There's like things that can interrupt your sales pitch. They wouldn't call it a sales pitch, but that is kind of like what it is in essence. And I think that may explain some of what I find sort of irrational resistance to a project like this, which is literally just like casting light, non-binding. Hey, if you want to have an overview and have a chance to see the picture from the top with all of these different metrics, here's a way to do it. And then people are like, no, why? But it messes with my dogma.
I mean, I think we get over concerned. I think that naturally humans see negative things larger than positive things. So like I've heard something like it takes 6 positive comments to overcome 1 negative comment, like in your mind when you're reading this stuff. And it's like there's a lot of people that are unconditionally supporting this idea that we need signaling in Ethereum, but there's a couple of people that all they do is talk shit. So of course they're going to say like, oh, but there's this problem, that problem, that problem. For me, the most important part is that it's a community project, and that like if you look at coin.dance, which is the only real example of signaling in the crypto space, and this is the for Bitcoin, it's actually run by Bitcoin maximalists. And they don't do they do a pretty good job. They try to be pretty fair, but for sure they're not going to work with us. So even though we would love to work with them, right? Because they don't like Ethereum. They don't want to help. They're not in it for the idea of signaling. They're in it to help Bitcoin, right? They're also not fans of Bitcoin Cash, but they do kind of do a little bit for them. But they don't like. They don't really give like minor votes or node voting awareness for that group either. And so, you know, what's really cool about Tenograph is that it has this opportunity where anyone can interact with it and support it. It doesn't have its financial backing coming from, you know, one source. Well, okay, right now it kind of does, but like. It's open because it's on Giveth and anyone can donate to support it. And we have like Giveth and Aragon are the groups supporting it now. But anyone can support it. And if they want a feature, they want to put up like we want this minor voting application to be on there. Someone can fund a bounty to put that on the website, and then we will use that bounty to put like pay somebody to actually make that happen. And anyone can do it, and it can be a community-run project. And I think that's really important to stop it from being gamed from above secretly, you know?
Just ask a question. I forget the fellow's name. Was it Harry that spoke from Inira or whatever? Spoke in the main room this morning. He talked. He had been at W3C, and now he's at Inira or whatever it was. He said one of the comment was no gods, and sort of this whole religious aspect, and looking back over the last 25 years of different protocols and standards, and how taking religious aspects. How is too much weight given to that core team, the Vitaliks, the Vlads? Is that? I mean, what's the danger there?
I definitely think too much weight is in there, but there's kind of a power law dynamic in human, like just forever. Like, Coca-Cola sells way too much Coke, right? And I thought Coke was illegal anyway. What are they doing? No. So, but there's people end up like focusing on just a few things because it's simple from the outside. But at the same time, these guys because of that, they also have a lot of influence, and some people who have way more influence than people even know are not really talked about. Specifically, I think Peter and Afri. Afri is one of the main guys behind the Parity client and is the main interface for people. And then Peter, who does the Geth client. These guys are the ones making the real decisions. They're going to listen to Vitalik, and they're going to see Twitter, and they're going to see these things. But I mean, if those two guys agreed, yeah, we should still push for hard fork in December, then it would happen, right? And I don't think, unless you are really deep in the game, you can't know that. And I don't know. I think if anything, I mean, there's definitely too much weight given to some people and not enough weight given to others. And we also need to realize who has this power.
A few weeks ago, I have a podcast called Zero Knowledge, which you guys probably know. I did an interview with Hudson, who is the guy running the core dev calls, and he just forever. This is not the first time he's mentioned this, but what ends up happening, unfortunately, is the core devs get together every 2 weeks and they talk about the issues, and that's actually where a lot of the sort of discussion and conversation about upgrades will happen, what will be included in a fork, what's a contentious EIP. That's where the conversation is going down. And Hudson organizes it, and a lot of the core devs on the call may not know that, or they may not be that interested in a lot of these things. And then he's sitting there kind of going like, so I get the sense that we're into it. Are we into it? And then people are kind of like, yeah, okay. And then he kind of is like, okay, we're into it. And he calls it Decree by Hudson, and it's super bad. That's not a good thing. That's like a problem. And he says it's a problem. I feel like even the influencers that you're describing feel that this is not, like, too much weight is being put on them. And the reason for this is that there's a lack of transparency into what is actually going on. You hear a lot of buzz from different places. Some influencers may have a bit of a better view. They'll voice it. People are attracted to it. But really, there should be more information going through the entire community so that like good opinions can be formed, and so that Hudson is not the one who gets to make the decision.
I feel like it's kind of trying to meet in the middle as much as you can, because the ones who have incredible influence, if they had more realistic information or better information, you can kind of pull them closer to, over here. And then those who are underrepresented through coin voting and gas voting and other mechanisms, they become more representative. So although like the power law dynamic, I think is just a part of human nature, we can at least bend the curve to be more favorable than it was.
Have you looked at things like multi-stakeholder cooperative type business structures?
They may not be that interested.
Because I mean, a cooperative business model, and they're not just earthy, crunchy grocery stores, right? It's $2.5 trillion flows through cooperative or mutual organizations. Most cooperatives, it's one person, one vote. But there are different structures where, because of either capital requirements, that there may be some members that have, so they modify some of the governance and voting structures. It may be something, so you take something like a utility. In the United States, 40% of electricity is produced by cooperative-owned utilities. Capital investment required, obviously, significantly higher than a grocery store. So they do there are different ways, and they modify the governance models and the voting structures, but they all tie back to the same idea of benefiting the community. There's 7 principles that all cooperatives globally tie back to some foundation from 1844 in the UK, where they all come from. So it's something that might be of use to look at.
What would you call that?
They're called multi-stakeholder cooperatives. Actually, the University of Wisconsin has a whole cooperative. I don't know if it's a business school, but they have a lot of stuff. The University of Wisconsin.
I think the one criticism that I could imagine being like, so say that was. I think it's really good to read up on that stuff, and I think it's important to, but I also think the sensibility of the community needs to be taken into account, and things like formalized cooperative boards and stuff seems like it wouldn't fit, at least not now. But I definitely think that inspiration could be taken from something like that.
More related to the space we're in and like our own sensibilities, it might be interesting to have like a TCR where people could register their own metrics to put on your front end. Something similar to that.
I would like to come back to what you said with the cooperative model. We see some organizations trying that out. Our Chain Cooperative is one of the blockchain projects which tries to be cooperative. But I think what is not compelling for a lot of members is the power structures which are built by the board of directors, right? So you have a strong board. The board can overrule. It really depends on how are people able to really cast their vote. How is the infrastructure represented? How do you ensure that there is no, no overruling of the board over the members, right? So such things are very dependent on the infrastructure you provide, and then it comes back to you need a trustworthy infrastructure for identity and voting. So a smart contract for the co-op to represent that governance model. And I haven't really seen that, that this is done or executed well. I think it's not the governance model itself. I think there are many models which have the advantages, but we haven't really seen a lot of those models being implemented on-chain so that they are trustworthy and that we don't have the same flaws of, centralization of power and influence.
Just to say what you were saying about token or someone creating their own metrics, absolutely. I really like this idea, like you were saying, it's normally one person, one vote. There have been little sub-experiments to identify uniqueness. There's actually a Giveth project that we support called Bright ID. That's like proof of uniqueness. But also there have been smaller projects, just like at DevCon 2, Piper Marion created a token that was like, I trust these 4 people to be identity oracles, and we will give you 1 token to an address that says you came to DevCon 2. Right. And so that token, if anyone, it could be used as a polling token, and you could create this thing, 1 person, 1 vote. Hey, should we return the funds to parity? Right. Well, this is one metric. Right. What do the DevCon 2 people say? What do the coin holders say? What do the users say that use gas? What do the influencers say? And if you have all those things and you can add other metrics, then this could be a really interesting opportunity, But in general, we need signaling. We need to know what other people are thinking. You can't reach consensus in a consensus protocol if you have no idea what other people are going to do. It doesn't work.
I fully agree with you. We don't really see the community right now. There is no way of self-reflecting on the state of the community we are in, and then it's super hard for ourselves to have a position or navigate between the other positions in the ecosystem. What I'm really impressed with is what work was done on signaling outside of the blockchain space, where we can, I think, greatly benefit from. Just to name one of them is Polis, for example, of representation of opinions, of communities. There's a lot of research in that direction where we, I think, can be open with, and where we can build bridges to accelerate the way how we can gather sentiment and understand where the community stands. I can talk more about that. It's like just imagine the value for parties of existing representative democracies to know where the voter base is at. So this is an old problem, right? And there's a huge value for them to know that. So there, when a lot of money went into that space to figure out the sentiment of the citizens, to be able to have a clear position as a party. So those are exactly the same researches we can leverage, and tools like Polis we can leverage to accelerate our path to give signaling tools to the community. Right, and there are other tools like Lumeo, you might have heard about it, which is more a decision-making tool, not so much a signaling tool, right? And the practices from the practitioner side, and when I say practitioners, I mean like the practices we can leverage in an off-chain community where we come together to form consent or rough consensus, which are not hierarchically based, which are self-empowering, are there and are around for decades. We just need to tap into that culture and bring it to the startups we create.
I love the idea of taking this the research that's already been done and applying it. And I think another space where we have the opportunity to do that is in statistics. There's this idea of something being statistically significant. And there are mathematical numbers that say like this is now statistically significant. This isn't. And when it comes to signaling, you have, how much of a signal, how loud does it have to be a significant signal? That's a really big open question. Yeah, and a lot of research to go into it, and And we can borrow from the model that's already been done from the mathematics to be able to inform that.
When it comes to mathematics, maybe I can add some points. I mean, finding consensus is about finding a good optima in the strategy in a kind of repeated game here. And what signaling is there nothing but cheap talk, which is a mechanism in mathematics to achieve good strategies in repeated games. So it's cheap talk. What you do is basically cheap talk in game theory. So
I guess cheap talk is not an insult in this case.
I wanted to connect to what you said before with the threshold. What we have seen with threshold is also the research in machine learning systems with signals, right? So I think we should, or I think we can get inspired by nature, and I think nature is a great architect. So going back to neuroscience and speaking about thresholds when neurons fire and all that stuff is, I think, something we can take inspiration from to also work with the systems we build. And humans can be understood as nodes which have a network and connectivity, and if a good signal comes in and it overachieves a specific threshold, we might share that idea, right? Or that signal. So I think we can get really inspired at that side and use that also to define protocols for signal passing in a signaling environment where we gather the signals from the community. So from the humans, I would say that's the best spot to gather the signals from, right? From everybody of us.
what do you estimate? How binding are the decisions made on your platform?
Absolutely not binding at all. It is so partial. There's kind of two ways to think about it. If the information is already there and the pressure is somewhat already there, and it's better organized and it's better verified and it's better collected and seen all at once. Yeah. And what was the other part? Maybe did you have another thing? Okay, I'll remember it in just a second.
I think signaling is one of the strongest powers you can introduce to your existing systems as well. Because if you think about Germany, it's a representative democracy. The parties want to be re-elected. And what we have seen is, for example, the pressure after Fukushima to opt out of nuclear energy was huge. Because the population was hugely against nuclear energy. On the other side, we had things like TTIP, where 98% of the population was against it, but there was no clear path of signaling that. So there were demonstrations, but nobody really knew how many people were really against it. So if you have a clear path, a trustworthy path or process to signal, this creates massive amount of pressure. And especially when it's transparent, I believe that existing parties are pushed into compliance. Because if not, they will create a huge outrage through, a huge outrage in the civil society, because they see that they act directly against their interests, right?
And I guess this is where I would come back to the earlier comment. When you if the conversation specifically around development of the Ethereum protocol and things of that nature is one thing, but when you start expanding out into the much larger societal frame, the potential for manipulation, even of the signals, it becomes much, much more significant. And then it really does become important to check, because that's essentially what happened. You could argue it's happened within Brexit, happened within the United States in the last election. It's happened possibly in Germany right now with some of the right-wing populists and in other areas. So it becomes a really tricky balancing act, I think, to try and figure out, is manipulation going on? Is it truly a signal, or is it manipulation?
If you guys were here for Vlad's talk in the morning, where he defined legitimacy in his own terms, his definition of that word was, I can't recall exactly what he said, but it was something like, something is legitimate if generally everybody can agree, everybody acts like it's true or legitimate. Yeah.
P.S. This is coming to you from Berlin, Germany, a place where a legitimacy of a regime and some systems. Or, I mean, that's scary a little bit to think about that.
What I wanted to say about that was like there's some concern as to whether a signaling system would be considered legitimate. Like, will people consider it like, I'm not part of this signaling system, therefore my opinion isn't counted in it, therefore it's not legitimate because it doesn't take into account what I think. But I think we've already addressed that quite a bit.
There's a little bit of, I don't know, I guess I hate using this word because trust has such like a bad vibe all of a sudden in certain conversations. But at some level, the core devs are going to make decisions on things, and people are going to make decisions on things. It's not like core devs are the only ones that make decisions. I got all of the stakeholders or all of the people involved have to make a decision. And if they're unable to see through some kind of influence, then we're already kind of lost a little bit. And so then the other side of that is there's a lot of education that needs to happen to help people see, oh, this is what this signal really, this is the significance or not significance. And then to the point of whether or not the site or things become significant is as long as people are using it in the technical sense. If it's useful, I feel like it's significant. If it's useful to at least some, if it's useful to the devs, if it's useful to people who have the questions and then they want to know these answers of, hey, what are other people thinking about, then it's at least significant enough for me.
Maybe a different approach to the signaling is defining these systems as defining the systems by the signals they care about, right? So if you're building a project, instead of saying this project is like, Ethereum, decentralized computer, why don't you define this project exactly by the signals it cares about? And then there is no doubt on what signals are valid and what things are not, because the project itself is defined by these signals. For example, I was working on governance systems where you, for example, decide the metrics. So the first thing you do is you define the system. So if you want, for example, build a water plan, you define the metrics that the people needs to participate on that system, right? And you define, for example, in case of identity, you can define certain metrics that the people needs to have in order to participate in the system.
But this means that you decide how exactly the processes look like and that you claim legitimacy of making those decisions for other people, because you will be the architect. And I find it very, very problematic, to be honest, to take that approach. On the other hand, I don't know how to do it better. But the problem is, if you design a system, you bias the system, I would say. And we are all biased, right? And this means if you set up the metrics in a certain way, you will heavily influence what the system can do and can't do. And yeah, so maybe you can share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree that's an imperfect system, right? But I think we want to go towards that there. But what you said is yes, it kind of lock you in, but you also can make these metrics like a formula that you can redefine. So you can have other metrics that allows you to redefine this formula. At the same time, most of my understanding is those systems are decentralized by nature and they're voluntary. And this voluntary is a key element because in today kind of state structures, they're I'm locked in on where I live and what I have to do and etc. Those systems I can opt out. So if I disagree in a lot of the systems, I can just fork it, right? So that's
I mean, the whole freedom to fork is really what enables a lot of this experimentation to happen, because if since no one is locked into the system, then the dominant strategy turns to your system is only as big as everyone's willing to work together, and there isn't a way to force or coerce someone to be a part of the system or to stay part of the system. Yeah.
I would partly disagree, because we speak always about the freedom of forking, but there are a lot of barriers for forking. So if you want to fork, it's super expensive to fork as a minority, because you lose a huge network effect. So you better not fork. And we see that, for example, with all the parity funds which are lost. I mean, a lot of people have an interest of forking, of fixing that. And we see how it's not happening because it's not strong enough, it's not big enough. There are like enough people which don't care. And there are other prerequisites for forking. You need to have the knowledge. You need to be able to drive the project forward from the developer side. You need to have the resource freedom to fork it, to survive the costs of the fork. Right, so I would say forking, it's a very nice thing to speak about. It's in theory very nice, but the reality is that you need a community to fork. The reality is that you need to have the know-how, the community to drive that forward, and that is not as simple as copying the code.
But at least the freedom is there, right? Which it's really not. I would love to fork out of the U.S. Really would love that. Yeah, I want to fork out of, Trump land. Let me out of there. I can't. I don't have that freedom. And that's the cool thing. It is still a voluntary choice. You know, you're still like, well, okay, it's not optimal for me to fork, so I'm going to stay with the main network because getting my funds back is not as valuable as maintaining maintaining my role in this community.
I mean, I think what you're trying to say with the difficulty in forking is it's not appropriate for things like bike shed issues, or like really small issues that very few people care about. You wouldn't fork out of the network if like you want to change the color of the logo or something, right? I don't know.
Also, there's a point. Let's assume your system works, and there's a hypothetical decision for a kind of hard fork. And all the core developers are against this. Let's assume, but the people on your side are completely for this. They can still do it, right? I mean, they don't depend on we depend on the government. If we are against something, we cannot change it, or we cannot change the law. But this still can be easily changed, and even against the will of the core developers, I would say.
The barrier of entry to forking is not only a problem, but I think the way that you articulate it, I vibe with a lot. The nice thing that still exists is that in the case of a fork that's already planned, like in an upgrade, even the smallest participant can choose to go along or not. And at that level, at least, you're not able to force or coerce someone to say, I will choose this fork over this fork.
I think when we speak about forking as a governance mechanism, I think we were speaking about final resort, like a very heavy decision, which is usually connected to high costs. And I think to have a little bit more differentiated debate, we need multiple layers of governance where minor changes can happen for smaller groups, which might live on shards on top of the core protocol, which changes very slowly, while we have heavy innovation in the shards, right?
And like, if you want to change the logo, you can make an EIP, and boom. At least that's how we do it in Ethereum.
Wouldn't it be so much easier to make a system if everyone knew what everyone was thinking about certain issues? That's a huge barrier of entry to moving the protocol forward, even on small things.
I like that idea of the shards kind of like being the little experimentation ground, though. I hadn't thought of that.
I think if we look at the world how it is, we see many cultures, and we see that people organize in a decentralized way with their cultures for like thousands of years, and that we don't find a way to find a consensus on the logo if we don't want to homogenize or say make everything the same. Okay, so so if we really want to have a diverse society, we need to find a way to have a agreed shared consensus on like the core layer, and have a way to have different representations on the shards or on a higher level or on the community level, right? So I think it's super important to have also different governance structures for the different layers. Because where do we want to make, for example, content decisions? If we all signal that a D app is malicious, right? It's fine. We can signal that, but there will be no way we effectively fork out the D app, because the core protocol and the core devs always move too slow to catch up with a small group of people which just, for example, copy the code base, change some things in the code base so it doesn't have the same fingerprint, and then redeploy it in a different shard, or say to a different, for example, Ethereum Classic or whatever, right? So they can always hop away. So if we think about those responsibilities as well, and that we don't want to create a weaponizable platform for a minority, right, then we need to think also about where do we want to have content governance? Where do we want to have kind of social contracts? And I don't want to have them for core protocol, right? Because this would mean enforcement for everybody who uses that protocol.
I mean, that's like the dream for me, where all of this is kind of going, is more ways to do more things more effectively, I guess. And how are we doing on time? Oh, okay. Now I interrupted my train of thought. So does it?
So just to jive off that, I mean, what are these blockchains good for anyway? Right? Like, we always have this disassociation between blockchains and people. Blockchains are here to organize people. There are social contracts implied on these blockchains, and you don't know it often when you're using that blockchain, right? Just like you don't know the social contract or the organizational structure when you go into a Safeway, you don't, or some grocery store. You don't know if it's a co-op or do you care? You go there for groceries, you go out, right? But the actual people that are organizing that system, they have social contracts that they live with, and I think that it's sad that we forget that sometimes. And if someone wants to fork a minority out of this social community, I actually think that's okay, and it's their right. It's the right of the community that is using this protocol to decide the right of association, right? Like if there's some horrible thing going on in Ethereum and everyone's against it, and we have a way to understand that everyone is against it, or such a large majority, then I don't think the core devs would blink to actually exercise their rights, the ability to write the code, to allow people to upgrade the software, just like they did with the DAO. I mean, we basically did that to the DAO hacker, right? We basically said, hey, you're breaking the social contract of Ethereum, so we're stealing your money, and back. And I don't know that that's a problem. I actually think that's definitely a feature.
I fully agree with you. And what we have seen, like with Ethereum Classic was a fork of the social, say, contract as well, right? It was like a decision of a moral decision taken from a community, right? But what I want to give a thought about is like, can we sustain that model in the current governance structure for 10 billion people?
I mean, if we go back to shards and stuff, if every little shard has its own contract and every little group can be left and joined at will, yes, you can. But as a large thing, it becomes harder and harder to enforce any social contract that you want to have.
I'm picturing now a dystopian sharded future where these little tribes go in such different directions that they can no longer understand one another. Sorry.
Well, one wonderful point. I think we see that right now because we live in different echo chambers and people don't understand each other anymore, right? So that is interesting. I think we have that already as well. Oh, Swamp City people.
That was a really fun discussion on signaling, guys. Thank you so much. Yeah, here.
Thanks for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe and give us a rating or comment if you enjoyed this content. This episode was brought to you by Santa and the unicorns at giveth.io. Remember, this podcast is made possible by the donations we receive from listeners like you. If you'd like to help support the podcast, you can do so by donating Ether at dattpodcast.com. That's DATT podcast.com. Please check the show notes for more information. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep decentralizing all the things.